Yo guys, I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for a brand new ranking video within this miniature series here on the channel. Today we're talking about, of course, the 16 cores coming from Skylanders Swap Force. It's really weird pointing with my left hand rather than my right, considering this is a dominant one. Anyway, I'm going to let that logo fade away and instead cut to all 16 of the Swap Force cores as I continue to speak over and just tell you how awesome they all look in unison with one another. And this is one very impressive cast. I even did a lock with all of them, that was live mind you. And it's from those live streams I'm going to be getting the gameplay for those cores. And so now that we've cut back to my face, I can just tell you that all 16 of these cores are fantastic, and this was not an easy ranking list to make, but I did revise it based on both the input of the chat from those live streams as well as my personal experience using those cores. So naturally, with this list being really refined to the extent where I literally played all 16 of these cores yesterday. Yesterday was when I completed that lock, mind you. So naturally, there are going to be some opinions on this list that you aren't necessarily going to agree with, and that's just the beauty of humanity, to even go as far as say the fact that there's 7.5 billion humans on the entire planet, and you're not going to agree with anyone on anything because opinions are based on a unique set of beliefs, experiences, so in other words, let's just be respectful of our opinions rather than tearing each other apart for them. But so far this miniature series has been great for respect. I really appreciate that. So let's keep that momentum moving forward. And without further ado, let's roll the intro and get on with the ranking of these 16 cores from Skylanders Swap Force. Without further ado. Unfortunately, coming in at number 16 for me is going to have to be Slobbertooth. Now unfortunately, this character is rather slow and dull in the pacing department, and his attacks are rather uninspired. He literally just swings his head back and forth, and then he chomps on enemies and then does like a tail strike. He's basically the equivalent of Walmart Bash, especially with his design. It takes such heavy inspiration from it, and it's so abundantly obvious too that it makes the character just far less memorable and distinctive because of it. So naturally this guy has a really slow paced moveset. He's powerful and I do enjoy that. In fact, I enjoy all of these characters to a certain extent, like I alluded to in the intro, and I do have fun with Slobbertooth, and the strategy is you have to choose whether to chomp on enemies and leave them or spit them back out, because if you of course leave them and swallow them, you heal yourself up. And then naturally for head swings as well, you have to choose whether to do those or a tail strike, for example. So there can be some variation in how you tackle his gameplay, which can make the character feel fresh at moments. So even the worst of the Swap Force course has his upsides, but unfortunately he's just the weakest of all of them, giving him number 16 on the ranking here. But for number 15 I have Dunebug, an excellent design might I say, but the moveset is rather lackluster. He just flies, which first of all is a waste of a tertiary attack, and secondly, I like how he can trap enemies in his orb and lob them off the edge. It's probably the best thing he has going for him, because his staff, his projectiles are at a slower rate of fire and deal less damage than most of his other fellow projectile based characters, making him far less effective. And because of that, you don't want to pick him over other characters that are just simply put better than him, especially in the range department. So therefore Dunebug just isn't the most effective in combat. He's not the most fun either, being a character whose tertiary attack has gone to waste because of it being a flight-based ability. It just ultimately makes Dunebug feel less lackluster, and just you have less of a fresh time playing with him time and time again, because it's just the same attacks rinsed and repeated without that tertiary attack to really vary things up. There's not enough variety here for you to ultimately enjoy, and that's what makes Dunebug some of the weakest gameplay from this ranking list. It's just ultimately his design being better than Slobbertooth that elevates him, in my personal opinion. But number 14 is going to be Riptide. He's incredibly unbalanced to where his hammerhead strikes are so much more better than his swordfish strikes. You might as well just not even use the swordfish strikes. But what's more effective than that is constantly switching out your weapons. So there's definitely a unique dynamic within his gameplay here that can make him more distinctive and memorable, and his design is just really nice as well, and there's a great personality to Riptide that I really enjoy playing alongside with. But ultimately, the very fact that he's a one-trick pony once again, and all you do is wind up using his hammerhead shark all the time, or switching out weapons all the time to get the most projectile damage you possibly can out of him, makes him one of the more boring, slower paced, and, you know, just less fun cores from Swap Force overall. And this is a really competitive category, so ultimately you've got to be better than this in order to do better than number 14 of the ranking, I suppose. And on top of that, Riptide, what ultimately elevates him to number 14 is the fact that he has his massive whale! Massive whale! Yep, I remember that from the streams. So, Riptide gets 14 for the massive whale alone, but moving on to 13 we have Rhino, a rather fast-paced character. You can pound the ground and move forward on your motorcycle, and has excellent knockback that ultimately balances him out, because otherwise with his melee attacks alone, if they didn't have knockback damage, then enemies would engage him far too easily, especially since he doesn't deal nearly as much damage as he needs to warrant being such a melee based character. But I love Rhino's design. I mean, he's a rhino with fired up fists that pounds the ground in a temper tantrum. Like, I used to have anger management issues growing up, and so naturally I relate to Rhino in this case. I didn't necessarily pound the ground and start making fire spit out of it when I threw a temper tantrum, but still, the relatability is ever so slightly there. I just hate how close and personal he has to go with his enemies. It can make him less effective because enemies tend to hit you back in these situations. So that gives Rhino number 13 on the list. Now number 12 is a character that has actually jumped up a few spots because I gained more respect for her through not only for core lock but also the praise that she seems to get from just about everyone. I still do think she's mildly overrated. Her attacks don't nearly deal as much damage as people give her credit for. Her best ability is easily for tertiary because it can draw in enemies and then deal 50 damage once she finishes it. And not to mention it's animated as well, it looks cool and it creates massive knockback, but ultimately the moveset just doesn't really flow. You go from a pounce and then you go into scratch, and there's no flow, no combinations to really do with this character, and the animations are really basic, and it's a shame given how incredible Scratch's design is. Like, first of all, we have the sharp contrast in colours. I mean, she's a cat with wings and then a like Egyptian mask type thing, so the culture behind this character is really well expressed, and she has phenomenal design. That's my favourite part about her. But for me, the moves just aren't fast paced, they aren't as powerful as they need to be, and that's just my silly personal opinion. So yeah, I'm going to move on before I continue to make people mad with my controversial views, I suppose. But hey, as I said earlier, this is merely an expression of my opinion, and I don't expect you to agree with me in the slightest. After all, it is our differences in opinions that make us human. So moving on to number 11, who could quite possibly be the opposite of a human. On that note, it's Grim Creeper. Yeah, you don't get far less humane than that now, do you? Hooded creeper that has one hell of an awesome moveset. First of all, it's fast paced and the moves have a lot more flow to them. Like your tertiary attack that knocks back enemies smoothly transitions into the primary attack combos a whole lot better, and there's some nice animations here, and he's great with crowd control too because of the hitboxes. You know, you can spin around your scythe and deal damage to enemies all around you. That's great. I love the design here as well. For light core, it is a phenomenal effect, mind you, and brings further meaning and symbology behind this character because he truly lights up, you know, where his ghostly spirit can be found. There's a ghostly spirit side of him which heavily reminds me of Igniter, and I have no problems with that whatsoever because Igniter's awesome. So overall, this character's powerful, he's fast paced, his moves flow together really well, but unfortunately he's not the most effective in combat. He has low health, and for reliance on melee, and the fact that he has a lot of end lag on his moves and they take a long time to set up can lead him to get some really cheap deaths because enemies get a little too up close and personal with him for my measure. So that's what gives Grim Creeper number 11 on the list right here. Now number 10 is Windup. Kicking off the top 10, you know already how strong the 10 from here are going to be, considering that Windup in and of itself is a phenomenal character that unfortunately got heavily nerfed after Swap Force. Swap Force is by far where he is the best. And what's so great about him is that he has a huge amount of maneuverability. He faces his enemies, so you can walk around them in circles, and that makes it very easy to dodge them. And on top of that, you can charge up a power punch, knock them back, and your enemies being able to hit you is an opportunity that doesn't often arise, because he has springs that launch smaller ones into the air, and then you can continue punching them, keeping them there, so enemies never get the attack cycle to actually hit Windup. And simply by maneuvering, you can wind yourself back up, or you can use the attack that pulls in enemies, and then it repels them once again, so they've been dealt a lot of damage and they've been knocked back. So ultimately, Windup is nigh unapproachable when it comes to him fighting against his enemies. It's incredible, this gameplay style. It's fast paced, it's maneuverable, all of the things I like. And his design, it's a toy. It looks like a literal toy. It's pure genius, or a Windup toy to be more specific, because man, that is just so clever. Having blades for hands, you know, and then a little Windup on top of him to make him look like a literal Windup toy as a toy in and of himself. I'm saying this twice just to put emphasis on the very fact that this design is incredibly creative and very well thought through, with a sheer amount of attention to detail. And yet he's still only number 10. That just goes to show you how great all of the cores coming up are, because ultimately it was the fact that I have bad memories of Windup in later games that, you know, really hurts him for me ultimately. And on top of that, you know, his personality for me is quite lackluster, or what he is really is another robotic type toy-esque Skylander, you know, there's nothing to really write home about. So he can be dull to play with at moments, and that's naturally what harms his spot at getting higher in the top 10 right here. But moving on to number 9 without further ado, for very top of the bottom half of the characters, we have Popthorn, a moveset that really flows together very well. You can easily go from being deflated to inflated with massive knockback and damage spikes in between. It's a really well thought through moveset that's intricate, layered, and really fun to take full advantage of, especially strategically, mind you. You can either have projectiles or the slams to knock back enemies, and either way it makes the character really fast paced, and every single time you tackle a new combat scenario, you tackle it in a different manner from the last, keeping him constantly fresh when you play as him. And his design is cute, even if it's, you know, a little bit more on the simplistic side. He's just a bit of a, you know, balloon with spikes really, and some tiny miniature wings. So I respect what he was going for with the design here. After all, it's approachable, it's cute, it's what kids want to play as. But at the same time, in comparison to other Swap Force cores, it's just less creative and less thought through, you could go as far to saying. So Popthorn is ultimately his design that lets him down, and the fact that his gameplay isn't as good nor invested as characters like Starstrike. Now Starstrike, because you need to reflect magical orbs, means that you maintain constant concentration on the game at hand, and it invests you further. And on top of that, it makes it really fast paced, because you're there firing off projectiles, and you have your fan spin that can not only deal melee damage to enemies around you, knock them back, but it also fires off your more powerful magical orb off at fellow enemies, or you can create a little rain of orbs and just trick your enemies into walking straight into it. It's just multiple things that happen at once to create sheer chaos, and it's just so much fun knowing that you're the one harnessing that chaos. Like Starstrike, phenomenal character, a design a little bit on the basic side. She's just another magical, stereotypical character, you could go as far to say, with her mysterious dress and fan type things, just to create an airiness of mystery, I suppose. And there is a sharp colour contrast between the pinks and the purples, but outside of that, the design is rather dull, and that is incredibly prevalent with the light core effect, where they barely even changed up the pose. They are incredibly interchangeable molds, and that is beyond disappointing. So Starstrike has lots of things going for her, and ultimately I suppose it's the fact that she requires and demands a lot of concentration that can make her rather frustrating at times as well. You know, you're so busy focusing on one thing that you lose sight of another thing, and that can become a huge nuisance, and you feel cheap because of it. Well, when Starstrike is defeated because of it, it feels cheap even, I should say, to be more specific. But moving on from there, at number 7 we have Countdown, a character I have a lot of bias for, because, you know, you remove that bias and this is maybe a number 10 character at best in this ranking. But ultimately for me, Countdown just has a personality that speaks to me. I love the fact that he's a literal bomb. He lobs his head off and it blows up. He fires off rockets from a distance, which is effective, and his little mini bombs can cause massive knockback. That's very useful in the midst of a heated battle where you have enemies all around you, and so all of a sudden your mini bomb just goes towards an enemy that's about to hit you, and boom! All of a sudden the enemy is knocked back and can't do anything against you. Countdown's gameplay is just fun, simply put. He's not nearly the most effective core, but who cares when you can play him and have such a blast doing it. Like, honestly, I love playing with his character, playing around with his personality, playing around with his really unique moveset that's incredibly memorable. What other character takes off their head, lobs their enemies, and then blows it up afterwards? Exactly, that's where the distinctiveness and memorability comes in with Countdown. It's creative, it's clever, and I love it. But we're going to move on to number 6 without further ado, which is going to be Zulu, a character that has a lot of attention to detail. I like the sharp colour contrast between the whites and the greens. It looks really cool. There's a nice personality there as well. And overall, Zulu's really effective in combat also. His projectile attacks swoop around and hit enemies twice. His boar creates great knockback, and his wolf can attack enemies that you aren't focusing on with your birds, and ultimately make it so they can't attack you because the wolves are defeating them, and they can even dig up food down the correct path. So ultimately Zulu just has a variety of tools to use for any situation, and that makes him effective and fun. And on top of that, I really love his design, the attention to detail. There's not only the sharp contrast and colours that I mentioned about previously, but he has things like a boar buckle on his belt, and on his staff you can see little head embodiments of a wolf, a bird, and a boar since he summons them, and it just creates a lore to this character that's really unique and fun to explore. Therefore, Zulu, without shadow of doubt, is coming in at number 6. Now, number 5 is going to be Punk Shock. Her moves flow together like clockwork. Like, seriously, you can fire off water balloons and then electrocute them immediately to cause massive shock damage to where enemies can't even seem to get close to you. Like, seriously, it took a freaking boardwalk to keep her stuck in order for her to be defeated in McCorlock in the end. Without that, you know, the enemies never would have got to even touch her because she can create stun damage in areas all around her. Her projectile attacks are really effective, though I must admit she can get quite dull pressing the same attack buttons over and over again, so she's not as fun as other characters, not right off the bat especially, but her design has a great detail to it. And ultimately, the next flaw I have with the gameplay, and really it's more of a nitpick because it is pretty similar to that of Zap. She was clearly inspired by Zap, so that can make her a little less memorable and distinctive because of it, and it can really, you know, make you not want to play with this character because you see her and you see Zap and you just see Zap as a better version of her. But ultimately I still have a blast with this character. She's still really fun and really effective in combat, and that gives her number 5 on the list. But moving on to number 4, we have Scorp, a character who is really fast paced. You can roll around the stage dealing knockback to enemies massively, and then, you know, that's great for movability too. Then his orbs and his tail deal damage over time, so you can just fire at an enemy and then run away and disengage. There's a great strategy, and his character constantly feels fresh as you're playing with him because he has just such speed to him. So yes, Scorp, without a doubt, is an absolute blast. But speaking of blasts, we have Bumble Blast, not for most well-designed Skylander. After all, we have seen trees done in Skylanders before, but the fact that this tree in particular has a bee bazooka and his mouth is made from a beehive with honey inside it, it does put a very clever twist on it to make him, you know, a little bit more memorable in comparison to the characters like T-Rex and Stump Smash that have the same design. So the execution here is truly where everything pays off. But Bumble Blast is just such a beast in combat. First of all, his bee mines can knock back enemies and cover them with honey, which slows them down, and the bees are attracted to them and deal extra damage. In fact, you can fire off bees while having your back to an enemy running off, and they will go towards your enemy and defeat them for you. There is no other character that can so effectively avoid combat whilst defeating enemies at the same time. Bumble Blast, when it comes to his gameplay, is one of the most effective in the game to play as. I don't know what you think when he was coding this character. He's just so overpowered and I love him. I love playing as him. He's fast-paced, he's fun, and above all, he's effective, which is exactly what should be important going into creating and building up a moveset for a Skylander from scratch. Now, number 2 is going to be Roller Brawl, my best friend's favourite Skylander of all time, and that gives me some natural bias, but there's just so many things you can do with Roller Brawl. As she's skating, you can headbutt enemies, you can spin towards enemies. It's really fast paced to have these moves just flow together so perfectly. Knockback is so massive that you can very easily engage an enemy with very strong melee attacks and just defeat them with absolute ease. I mean, she's a vampire on skates that are made of blades, for Pete's sake. What about that does not imply raw awesomeness? Roller Brawl is fast, powerful, and more importantly, incredibly fun. Again, her gameplay is always fresh because there's always a new way to tackle a combat scenario with, because she just has so many tools and so much variety within her gameplay style that makes her so much fun. And speaking of fun, for number 1, without a shadow of doubt, I have Smolder Dash, my second favourite Skylander of all time, and it's easy to see why. Her moves have such a natural, organic flow to them. You can initiate her Clips mode, create a sun that draws in enemies, and as they're drawn in, you hold your Y button, which comes naturally. Well, not your Y button, your square button, I should say. But then you can just hold the square button, and that's not exactly difficult because you just pressed it to initiate the sun explosion, and then you can launch up into the air, bring down a rain of suns. Man, this character, she just has so many moves that combo into each other so perfectly. You can even fire off a sun, it can go through a few enemies, you can engage another one that's miles off with your whip and go back to the sun, hit it again, draw in all the enemies. There's just so many things you can do with this character, and it's ultimately the organic flow to her moveset that makes her so fast paced. Like, seriously, you can go into a combat scenario and you will be initiating attacks from beginning to end. She never has any end lag. Whenever enemies hit you, it always feels like it's your fault, making her really balanced and really fun, a really risk type reward moveset to play around with. I love her design as well, just a full black Lady of Liberty inspired statue with a fire whip, for Pete's sake. I mean, her molds are awesome. You know, there's just so many cool things to digest with this character, and that's why, without a shadow of doubt, she comes in at number 1. Now, with that all being said and done, this video is coming to an end, but before that happens, I first want to thank all my Blazing Knights and Scorpion Dragons whose support allow me to continue pumping out quality videos like this one. Without them, this all wouldn't be possible. Therefore, I genuinely appreciate every last one of you from the bottom of my heart. If you enjoyed this video, I have others you can watch by clicking on screen now, and you can even subscribe by pressing the button on the bottom right hand corner of the screen. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next one, but until that moment arises, peace!